hello to everybody, and I thought we'd just start just with a quick introduction to myself. As Laura mentioned, Theory of Change is one of my specialist areas for inFocus consulting. I've worked on theories of change for, I think 2009 was the first theory of change I worked on, and I worked on logic models quite extensively before that as well. I did develop the e-learning course with my team, and that's one of many theory of change trainings that I've run. I think I've worked on theory of change in about 30 countries now as well around the world. And I thought just to sort of warm up, I'd just share my craziest theory of change experience that I've had as a facilitator. So this was in Rwanda, and I'd just gone there on holiday, having worked in a neighboring country, and I turned up to visit a project, and I expected to just be looking at their activities, and I was in shorts, so it's very casual. And then I turned up and there were 12 people waiting, or I think 10 actually, all waiting for a theory of change workshop that they thought I was running on my holiday. So I didn't want to let them down, so I went ahead. It was fun anyway. But then the weirdest thing was, in the background there as well, there's also a Japanese documentary crew who were filming for a sports video they were doing about the Olympics. So I was interviewed by the Japanese documentary crew, and then there was a brass band playing in the room above the workshop as well for the entire time. So I don't know if I dreamt it, but there is a photo, so maybe I didn't. So yeah, I've worked on this technique in lots of different locations and situations. And I wanted to kick off really just with 20 minutes to start with, just to reorientate you with theory of change. Some of you may have been through the learning, some not, I imagine at different times as well. So we wanted to just spend an interactive 20 minutes introducing you to the methodology. And then we've got a half-hour session where we're going to jointly go through an exercise to look at the challenges with theory of change and some of the common solutions, and give you a chance to ask questions there as well. So first thing to mention in it is, or to talk about, is why do we use theory of change? What are some of its key benefits? And what I'd like to do here is to ask you to take part in an exercise. So I've brought up an image here, and very simply what I'd like you to do is to just type into the chat box, what do you see in this image? What is it that you can see here? And when you type in the chat box, if you can make it available to everyone, that'd be great, because I'm not sure if I can see the chat if it just goes through to Laura. But Laura, if it just come through to you, we can help to look at that together. But that's all we'd like to ask you to do. Start with just type in what you see on the right-hand side in the chat box. Great. So I'll read out just some of these. You can see them as they come through as well. We've got three cars. Yeah, two cars, 3 cars, 1940s style cars. I like the holidays in the 20s. 3 beautiful cars, 3 cars, trees and a house. So you're all going for similar. So 3 old style cars, nostalgia, a British neighborhood, maybe. And so that's our description of the photo. But what I want to show you now is just the reality of that photo. So what you can see here, we'll just zoom in a little bit, is that actually it's 3 little toy cars which are positioned on a board, and then it's just very carefully photographed so that you think that there are 3 real cars in the background. And I'd just like to show you one more image as well. So many of you will be familiar with this as well. It's Diego Maradona at the 1982 World Cup against Belgium. What do you think about when you see this image? So again, if you can type into the chat box, what does it say to you? You know, it might be an emotion, might be again just describing the picture. It's a very iconic photo, and what does it mean to you? Oh, Julie, you mentioned your video box was hiding one of the cars. That's where you mentioned 2 cars. So that's good to clarify. So we've got here some great descriptions. Maradona's the best, suspense, overcoming the odds, alone against the country, strength and smart. It takes 6 opposition players to keep him off, which is really what I always get the feel of. It looks like he's about to dribble around all 4 of them. Trickery, good male player. Belgium against Maradona. I think that's a really good description as well. I like it. So this isn't quite, we've not been quite as tricky here or tricksy. So the actual image that you see here. So what had actually happened, it's a really famous photo. But what actually happened was that you can see, I'll get my little annotation pen here. You have Maradona, he was, there was a free kick, which was kicked against the wall here. So the photo was taken from this angle, and then he just passed it. He passed it either to the side or forward. So it looked like he was about to dribble through the entire group of players, but not quite the reality. Although in the actual match itself, he did dribble around a good chunk of the team several times. So there's probably some truth to that photo as well. And the reason that we mention these is because it's very easy when we go through our day-to-day lives, but also as we go through running projects or programs, to just assume that things are as we see them, as we hear them. It's very easy to fall into patterns of making assumptions. And this is where theory of change is really, really useful. It helps us to map out and to, it's a technique of mapping out how our services or products, how our activities lead to impact and where they fit in a wider context. And so by mapping out what we do, we help to uncover some of the assumptions about our work. And I've worked with a lot of organizations where we uncover often quite subtle assumptions about our activities and the programs that are being run. And we often also make an analogy back to like a blueprint of a product or service. So again, that's what we're doing here when we're creating a theory of change, is creating a plan of how we expect our activities to work in a certain way. So that's one of the benefits of theory of change. It brings assumptions out into the open, and it gets everybody on the same page with what's being done and how. Sorry, should mention as well, I did not realize Belgium won that game. Thank you, Benjamin. I didn't actually note that, so that's good to know. So what I'd like you to do now is just to type in again into the chat box, and we'll pick out some of your responses. What other benefits are there to developing a theory of change? Be easier, I think, if you've been through the learning course as well, but what do you think are the benefits of developing a theory of change, of developing that map of how activities lead to outcomes and impact? And we will be looking at some examples in a moment as well. And so those that have come through so far, so we've got getting clarity, which I completely agree with. And again, that's great when you're challenging assumptions. You're looking at the way that you assume activities lead to outcomes and impact. Getting the entire organization on the same page, and also with partners and potential partners. Julie, you mentioned stepping back on a project. We really find that with when we do a full theory of change workshop, that it is a chance. Sometimes because those in the workshop just haven't had a day or two to literally sit back and look and think about how a project works or activities work. Create and implement impactful projects, getting common understanding and direction, getting more systematic approach, clarifying expectations. And here's a key thing too, from Karine here, what to monitor and evaluate. So that's often a big reason to develop a theory of change. Not the only reason, but a big reason is to then measure impact, to conduct monitoring and evaluation. Clarifying common paths has come up here as well, taking a more schematic approach. So I would agree with all of that. Definitely would be big benefits of developing a theory of change. You mentioned here funders too, it can be a really powerful fundraising tool as well, and a powerful tool for going both to existing and new funders, particularly as it's a technique that seems to continue to grow. And then finally there, we've got helping to identify gaps and when designing a project. So yeah, it can be very, very helpful to critique a project at the design stage. It's a great time to be working on a theory of change. So what I'd like to do now is just to talk about what do we mean by a theory of change? What makes a theory of change a theory of change? Because I've seen a picture and it's been described as a theory or a diagram just of maybe, you know, with 5 words, and it's described as a theory of change. I've then seen like a 20-page detailed document described as a theory of change. So what is it that makes it a theory of change? So what I'd like to do, actually, we have 5 criteria that come from a report about 10 years ago now for DFID, and we still really like these criteria that we use when we're saying, you know, what should ideally be in a theory of change, which would be good practice for that theory of change. So what I'd like you to do, we've got a poll, it's going to come up, and we're going to ask you, we're going to give you 6 options, and we're going to ask you which one of those options do you think is not a key characteristic of a theory of change. So that will just jump up on your screen now. So this is the one that is not. There's an incorrect answer in the 6 here. Again, if you've been through the e-learning, it'll be a bit easier, but see what you think.
I'll give 10 more seconds. More than half are voted now. And don't worry, it's anonymous. So if you don't know, just guess.
Should have mentioned that. Yeah, thank you. Great, awesome. Well, should we cut it off at that point? Perfect. Well, yeah, the majority of you got it. We would say an organogram wouldn't necessarily be part of a theory of change. There's definitely some flexibility with what you put in your theory of change, but for us, it's these other 5 areas, which I'll just come back to our presentation to talk through. So for us, a theory of change should have context. So it should explain what you do in the context of the wider ecosystem of what partners are doing, what other stakeholders are doing, like local government, for example. It should also show long-term change. So it should show some form of impact, the longest term social changes you're looking to work towards. There should be some kind of process or sequence of change which is taking place. Now that could be linear. And I guess one of my weaknesses in a way with theory of change is that most of mine are linear. I think in that way, whereas I've seen some brilliant circular theories of change and that take all kinds of different forms, but all of them show some kind of sequence of change happening. It should ideally include assumptions. So these are your beliefs about how and why your theory of change works as it does. And we're going to come a bit more onto assumptions later because they can be quite a tricky part of the theory of change. And it ideally should be a diagram and then potentially also a narrative summary as well. Most theory of changes I see and would be understood to be a theory of change are a diagram, normally around 1 page, but then you can get much more detailed theories of change. And as we'll come to a little bit later, we like to suggest having also a narrative summary alongside your, a lighter 1-page theory of change is a really good compromise to get between the two. So generally, if we're looking at a theory of change, we'd want it to include these 5 different elements. And a little later, when we look at challenges, some of these aspects will come up when we look at some of the common challenges that we've come across in Focus. And my penultimate part of this brief introduction is just to go through our own theory of change format at inFocus. Again, it's ours, it's what we use. We try to base it on what the most common approach is globally, but others will have different approaches to theory of change. And that's why having those 5 criteria gives quite a bit of flexibility with what it then looks like and what you name things as well. So don't feel this is the only way to do theory of change, but it is the version that corresponds to the e-learning course as well. And so we're going to come to each of these sections in a moment. But the other thing to mention is, again, as you can see here, this was for a client. I've changed their name because they got a brand new theory of change. This is from about 5 years ago. And they called it the worm, which I thought was a little unfortunate. I thought maybe snake is a bit more engaging. But it just shows you here, it's got slightly different wording. It's got, you know, more of obviously a linear pathway flow and lots of boxes, but it still would meet the criteria that are within the 5 characteristics that we mentioned. It's just to show you that they can look very different. And so we have these 5 areas to theory of change that we use at inFocus. And we've got an example here from Football Connects. This was our pretend organization we included in the e-learning course. I'm not going to go into detail on each of the boxes. I'm just going to give you an idea of what each section includes as a recap. So in inFocus, we really like to include the situation. Not everybody does in a theory of change. It's probably the bit here that you'll see that's missing from others, but we really, really like it because it helps to set the scene and set the context. So we look at the problem that's being addressed through the activities. We look at the target audience that's being focused on and that you're looking to help. And then we look at the range of stakeholders which could influence the theory of change. And so next we go over to the impact. And this is a key part of theory of change and the methodology, is that you go to the longest term change. We're going to come a bit later to how long term to go, which is one of the challenges many people find. And then we work our way backwards. So then we go into an outcomes pathway and we think about what needs to happen for that impact to take place. Now, you'd normally have more boxes than this. It's a very, very simplified version. But here you're looking at the changes that need to happen, both that you influence, but also that happen in wider society. And then there are activities and inputs. We don't include outputs in our version, but you definitely could. And most theories of change probably do. I have my reasons for not including them, which I'm going to come to a little bit later. But many do, and that would be perfectly valid as well. But at the minimum, it's a description of your activities. So what is it that you do to generate those outcomes and that impact in combination with everybody else working in the same area? And somebody mentioned a bit earlier, and I didn't read it out, I didn't quite get to it, I think Katerina mentioned that theory of change can help to identify gaps when designing a project. And this is partly why we look at the activities, is to map onto the outcomes as we describe in the e-learning course, and then look at what we do, where there might be gaps, what partners could do as well. And then we include inputs as well into the mix. So what is it that goes into running the activities? And finally, we have assumptions, my favorite part of a theory of change, because here you're thinking about what's already in place that drives the theory of change. What are our core beliefs behind it? So the central one here, for example, is sport is the most appropriate tool for the inclusion of refugees in the wider community. And so what we do, if we're then moving on to measurement, is we explore these assumptions and we think about, are they true or not? And on what basis did we make these assumptions? Like at the start, it's very easy to just go through day-to-day life. We see things, we hear things, and we make those assumptions, not always challenging them at the same time. Like, why is a program 10 weeks and not 5 weeks? You know, this is where assumptions can really help, and it's often the most engaging bit of a theory of change. So in my final minute of this very brief intro to theory of change, just a little bit about the end product, where you're trying to get to with a theory of change. So what we find normally is most common is that you have some form of one-page theory of change. You can see an example here on the right. It's a very boxy one. You know, a designer can have a real go at this and come up with something a bit more intuitive, but generally it will look something like this, where you're describing what you do on one page. But then what you also might have is a more detailed narrative, which could just be in words, it could just be written, but it could also be, you know, more diagrams, like this is a problem tree, and it digs into the problem part of the theory of change in more detail. And the advantage of having both a one-page and then a more detailed narrative is that you can use it for different purposes then. Like some people that you share it with will just want to see the one page. Some will want to see that detail and understand the detail, perhaps more on the impact measurement side. So it's very useful to have both, but sometimes you'll see a theory of change like the template Laura showed at the beginning, which is just a one-page summary, and that's very common as well. But it's quite good to consider whether a longer narrative alongside it could be useful. I will make sure we share some examples after. I think they're in the e-learning, I'm pretty sure they are, but we can share them by email as well. So I've got 3 good ones you can have a look at afterwards where we show how a narrative and one page interact. So happy to share those. But that's our brief introduction. Now, if you have any questions, please do drop them into the chat box as we go. I'll be sticking around at the end as well, as long as it's needed for any questions. But and we're coming to the challenges next and going through an exercise on that together. But it's great if you can also pop any questions into the chat box as we go, because it may be that I can pull in those questions as we go through. So what we're going to come to next and start to engage you all in the process, I'm going to now go through a very simplified flow of how you might develop a theory of change. And then what I'd like to do is to ask you all about some of the challenges that you might see, or you might anticipate, or you've already seen with developing a theory of change across this process. So, and then what I'll do after that is also go through and answer some of the questions that you sent through before the workshop, along with some of our most common challenges and how you might address them. So developing a theory of change, we would often think of this, well, it's both developing, but also the entire usage of a theory of change, really. So we've broken it across 3 steps. So firstly, preparing to develop your theory of change, then developing it in whatever way that you choose when you're planning, and then a bit about then using your theory of change and making sure it doesn't just sit in a drawer somewhere or in a file, in a folder online somewhere and doesn't get used. So I'm going to just talk you through some of the steps you might go through, and then ask you to feed into with some of the challenges that might emerge. So firstly, when preparing to develop a theory of change, really important firstly to define the purpose. Why is it that you need it? Often, for example, if it's for marketing and communication purposes, then maybe just a one-page theory of change might suffice. You might not need a narrative. It might be that there's less text. It's much more about just the communication of it. Whereas if you're developing a theory of change for impact measurement, you might need quite a bit more detail in the mix. Determining the scope is important. Is it just for one activity or set of activities, or is it for an entire organization? Sometimes they can be at even higher level for a network of organizations. Then deciding who to involve. So often, the wider you can go, the more participatory, the better. It takes more time, but it's an area we found that actually gets some really good engagement across an organization, that you get communications people interested, you get senior management interested as well. It depends on the people and who you're working with, but because in the end, you're mapping out what you do and how you do it, tends to be something that people find interesting more generally. And then the final point here is then deciding how you're going to develop your theory of change. So it might be in a workshop as a group, although less opportunity for that right now, obviously, especially in the UK with COVID. Or it might be some kind of online workshop or webinar, or it might be between a mentee and mentor and just involving the 2 of you to start with. So it's good to go as wide as you can, but it depends on your time and your resource. But once you have developed it, as we'll come to later, sharing it and getting feedback into it is important if you can't involve more people at these earlier stages. And then you develop your theory of change, which includes the sections that we mentioned: situation, activities and inputs, outcomes, impact, assumptions. And you then write that up and you have that available. And then finally, using your theory of change. So it should be a living document, shouldn't be left on a shelf or somewhere to gather dust. And then it could be, for example, you use it in learning workshops to reflect on findings from evaluations that you do. It could be as a basis for impact measurement and management. So you use it to develop data collection tools. It could be also in funding bids as well. So lots of reasons to develop it and ways to use it. And what I'd like to just ask you now is, thinking across this whole process of developing a theory of change, what are the main challenges that you feel might emerge? If you could type them into the chat box. Might try and bring in one or two of you as well if you are up for coming in to speak. Maybe if you raise your hand, happy to bring you in. But if you could also write in the chat box, that'd be great. And we'll just go through those as a group before we share some of our main challenges and solutions. So I'll just go quiet for a moment as you're writing in there. I think what we can do there as you're writing in as well, we can also share some of our, perhaps one or two of our challenges that have emerged for us, and just give you an idea of what we're thinking of here in relation to theory of change, and just give you a chance to type in as well. So while we do that, so Laura, you mentioned, so getting the organisation on board and committed to developing one in the first place, and that might need some internal advocating, which I definitely would agree that's often the case. The worst example I've had of going into a workshop and getting feedback, I won't say who it was. I went into the workshop to develop the theory of change. It hadn't really been sold internally, and the most senior person in the room made a very, very rude comment about the process and what we're about to do, which is quite scary if you're a facilitator. So what we had to do there was then go through an additional 5-10 minutes of explaining, like a bit like we've done today, what are the benefits of theory of change, how can it support you, why are we doing it? And then we got into a drawing game, and he got really into the drawing game, and that seemed to calm him down, and it was okay after that. So it speaks to the value of drawing games as well, I think. So yeah, definitely would agree. I think really important to talk to particularly senior management about theory of change, why do it, why you're interested in doing it, and getting them on board. Really, really key. If you don't have that support, also the using your theory of change, it just may not get used in the final analysis. It just may, again, just sit on the shelf. So I'll go through a few more of ours as well, or I've got a couple more coming in that I'll read out actually. So Katerina, you've mentioned the current circumstances, with the pandemic and then the restrictions definitely being a challenge. I think that definitely, I'd agree, it definitely speaks to, well, I guess it's the practical challenge of running it in running a theory of change workshop online. We do a lot of that even before the pandemic. It definitely can be done, and what I can do afterwards, if it's useful, is share some different tools that we found useful, some different software packages that we really find useful for developing a theory of change online. But it ended up being, to be honest, that when we have developed theories of change online and in person, I mean, in person is probably in the end better because you can engage more. But the benefit of doing it, so if you're doing it in person, you often need to take a half day or a day or 2 days of people's time, and it can be quite tiring. The benefit of doing it online is you can do it in more sort of 1 hour to 2 hour segments, and actually we found that really effective. There are some benefits of that. I guess the other side of the pandemic challenge is just people finding time and the priority to do this, which again I think would speak to the advocacy part of this, of being able to explain why this is going to be useful, showing some examples, and getting people on board. Because I can understand that, yeah, getting the time in from people may be difficult right now. So, and Hannah, you've mentioned a similar thing, how to start and where to start with a mentor-mentee aspect when Corona is here, which again would speak to similar point to Katerina as well. So I think again, it's definitely possible to develop a theory of change online and do that as a remote session. I couldn't emphasize that enough, that we've done that so many times, even before COVID. It's definitely possible to do in that way. What I would do is to break it down into some really like smaller parts, some more digestible parts. So I would like start with saying, look, we're going to take an hour and we're just going to go through the situation part of the theory of change. We're just going to do that bit, write it up, come back then and say, next time we're going to look at impact and outcomes, do that for an hour and a half and come back. So I would just, it can be overwhelming when you try and do it all in one go. It just doesn't, I mean, it's impressive if you can, but that's often what people try, is they're like, right, we got an hour because we've only got an hour and we're going to try and do the theory of change in an hour, and it just doesn't have room to breathe. So I would definitely be breaking it up into pieces, and the more you get into it, hopefully also the more that becomes quite, an enjoyable experience, because you're getting the benefit of your mentor's experience as well, about each section of the theory of change. The other thing I can share on that front is a typical flow of developing a theory of change, how much time to dedicate to each part. I'm just thinking of what might be helpful to you to share after the workshop.
May I, Tom?
Sorry, Laura?
May I share a comment?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
First of all, thank you for everything that you shared already with us. It's really helpful. Regarding my comment about the current circumstances, the pandemic one,
yes.
The challenge for me is not how we're going to implement it right now. For sure, the online solution is a solution, regardless of how tired all of us are. But what I'm referring to is the actual result of the theory of change. I mean, we're designing with our mentors a theory of change, which must lead at some point to actual sport activities, to actual sport programs. We're not only here, for example, if someone is designing a project regarding advocating through sports, it's different. But again, sport is action. Sport is regards activities. So this is what I'm referring when I'm, that's the thing, because it's sport, it's action. So
yeah.
Since we have no idea until when this situation is going, to last, it's really frustrating, and it's a huge challenge to try to design something that you don't know when it's going to be actually allowed to be implemented, to be on the ground, to have the actual action and the actual impact that we all share this vision about impact through sports. That's what I'm talking about mostly.
Yeah, that's difficult. So I understand that. Thank you. Sorry, and I saw Laura come off mute at the same time, so I thought it was Laura, and then I realized Laura's not talking. So sorry, Katerina, I didn't realize who it was initially.
No worries. I wanted to say the same thing as Katerina, that the uncertainty of the sector is a big thing, when you're planning for the future and long-term impact, and it can be also a bit demotivating when you don't know when you can actually carry out this sporting activities that are planned for many of the mentoring pairs.
Yeah, it's really, really difficult. Not an easy answer to that either, I'd say, on that side. I think, I would definitely, if there's no activity, it can be right, which I understand because it's sporting activity, then yeah, I think you could only do it practically thinking into the future. But I understand that's a slightly demotivating at the same time to go through that exercise. That I can totally understand. I mean, the only way to look at it then, I guess, would be that it's a future planning exercise. It would be a sort of a test for the theory of change technique. I think if you think of it maybe in that angle, that look, this is a way that we can practice a technique and be able to use it effectively by using example. I know lots of organizations who've done that, where for different reasons than COVID, it's just they wanted to try out the technique. So an example I've got is an organization who they created a theory of change for a child protection. So not even it was sort of their child protection approach they did in a theory of change format, but they only did it because they wanted to test the theory of change technique. So I think, you know, I could imagine a theory of change that could respond to conditions as they are now, but I think your best bet, it probably is to think into the future. And I don't know what you think as well, Laura, because you're more aligned to what you're asking their mentors and mentees to do here.
Yeah. And Sasha can also jump in if she has any comments, because this is a very difficult issue. And I've spoken with some of the pairs individually about this as well, you know, and the need might arise that you need to shift, you know, the plan that you had for a theory of change or the impact you would like to have. But at least with some of you, we discussed that this could be a way to start with a new program or project and kind of design it from scratch and think about new ways to involve it and kind of build on the, you know, strategic approach of trying something new and really, you know, see what is possible under the current circumstances. And if there is a lot of uncertainty about the future, then maybe, you know, working on a process inside the organization, like safeguarding, to setting up some of these policies and strategies that we might not have always time for in our daily life when, you know, events are going on like crazy. So maybe that's the advice. But Sasha, if you have something, then I'm also all ears. If she's still in the chat. Yes, she is.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I don't have more to add, but maybe from experience I have is in this kind of situations, it's nice or good to be focused then on a smaller activities, on smaller outcomes, and not go big and to the long term, because we don't see it yet, or it's very difficult to discuss. Because then in some organizations we can lose the motivation, and it's like, yeah, we don't know where we get out of it. So maybe it's also just better to focus then on the smaller activities, on specific topic. We have a specific topic in IRTS, but maybe, you know, just build their theory of change on this. Yeah, so that's the only comment I have right now. But I'm aware of the situation, and it's difficult in all. Yeah, but especially it's very, very difficult in IRTS field. I mean, not integration of refugees through sport, but integration of refugees and their situation. That's a big issue. Yeah, in this time now.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good idea. Yeah, just to keep it a bit more focused, and we're going to come to this in a moment in some of our challenges and solutions. It's like how far to go with the impact, which is totally up to you how far to go. So you could keep that really quite focused and keep it quite limited. And there's another comment here in the chat as well that, you know, now is, I guess, also a time where you could potentially do more thinking to sort of think, well, to make it easier to restart after the pandemic when things get a bit more back to normal. And also theory of change, that they are, I mentioned, they're a living document. They change a lot, and the best theories of change regularly, you know, adapt to circumstances. So that some organizations I know who really use their theory of change effectively, you know, it's every 6 months they're looking at it again, reviewing it as a group and tweaking it and documenting what they change. So I think it's also whatever you create now, you can adapt and change in future. Another approach, if you want to be super ambitious here, would be, you know, theory of change is also a very useful problem solving technique. So, you know, you could use it to think about, okay, where do we want to get to? You know, what's our sort of change we want to make to our activities to make them more sustainable in future, and you know, use it in that way. What are the changes we need to get to that point? I can perhaps write a little bit more on that afterwards, but there are kind of other ways to use it as well. But I think, Sasha, your point on the keeping it limited, I think is a good plan. Good stuff. Well, we've got 50 minutes to go, so any questions or any more challenges that you can think of here or that you've had, please do keep writing them in, and any questions generally about theory of change, and we will get to them. What I'd like to do now, just for 5 minutes, is just to go through some of our main challenges that we've come across with theory of change. A couple of them came from, I think 3 of them maybe came from you sending in your questions ahead of the workshop, so we tried to just answer them here as well, and a couple come from our experience too. So one of the first things to mention is about distinguishing between outcomes, outputs, and assumptions. We tend to use outputs a bit less in our theories of change, but they're perfectly valid to use. And that template Laura mentioned, it's in PowerPoint. You can change it as you wish. I think the other thing to mention is that terminology in theories of change, or every theory of change I've developed, pretty much has different terminology that's used within it. So, some people call outcomes an outcome pathway. Some people might call them just social change. Some people don't like to have impact. They like long-term outcomes. As long as it's there, it doesn't really matter. So outputs, you feel very free to put them in your own theory of change. It's just a choice. We make it inFocus not to. So distinguishing between outputs, outcomes, and assumptions is one thing we get asked about a lot. Outputs are the most immediate results of activities in our terminology. Outcomes, though, do represent changes that need to happen for that results we put here, but for the impact to occur, you need changes to take place. So outcomes represent changes. That's the biggest thing to note. And the biggest mistake in theories of change is where you've got a list of outcomes and they're not representing changes. Whereas assumptions are representing what's already in place. What are your existing beliefs about your theory of change that you feel are, like if you're working with teachers, there's an assumption that teachers are interested and have the capacity to engage with the program. That would be an assumption that would ideally need to be tested in the program working with teachers. So I was trying to get the simplest distinction between the three, but in the end, don't worry about it too much, because is it an output? Is it an outcome? Is it somewhere in between? It's not a huge challenge as long as it's somewhere in the theory of change. So we make these distinctions, particularly with outcomes, because we want to make sure that changes are represented, that it isn't just an activity-focused theory of change, that it has that in there. So that it is important, this terminology, but often I've been in workshops where there've been like 30 minutes of discussion about whether something is an output or an outcome. And my point is it's in the theory of change, it fits. That's the main thing. So don't worry too much on that point. Another issue with theories of change that I come across is that they don't always include the external context. They get very focused on what your activities result in, but then forget to bring in where does your change that you're looking to generate fit in the wider context of who you work with. So it should reflect the work of the wider sector. And a helpful tip here, if you've gone through a list of stakeholders, easiest way to address is to say, okay, for each stakeholder, do they generate any outcomes that should be in the outcomes pathway? It's a really simple way of just checking that. So you think, okay, local government, do we have outcomes in here that represent local government or not? So that's just a tip that we use, which works very effectively for that. The third point of our 5 here is how far to go with the impact. Another big question we get. So there's different options here. I always say it's completely up to every organization. I've had impacts which are 5 years. I've had impacts which are a generation away. And we use this little diagram here just to get a feel for where to go. So you've got short-term to long-term, left to right. You've got wider society and focus just on your users or your target audience, and very narrow. So over here is the time that you're focused on, and here is the who your impact focuses on. So if you go, you know, for an impact that focuses on wider society in the long term, it's a bit less tangible, but it can represent the eventual social change. It's more aspirational. It's more linked to your organizational vision potentially as well, if it's an organizational theory of change. Whereas if you focus on an impact that's shorter term and just focused on the people you work with and not wider society, it's a lot more tangible and measurable, but a bit less aspirational. So there's no right or wrong answer. You could have an impact which is 5 years away. I think most common would be an impact which is somewhere up here, wider society, longer term, but totally up to you. And this is Sasha's point too. I think in this time of uncertainty, maybe shorter term focus on users is a better way to go with your particular theories of change you're either developing or about to develop. And the penultimate point, I love this phrase. Whoever sent it to us, I'm going to borrow it now. I probably need to copyright it. It came from one of this group sending through one of their sort of challenges that they have with theory of change. And it's a wonderful phrase. So whoever wrote that, thank you. And I like it because it's about, you know, we talked about assumptions at the beginning and your own lens through which you see the world, and it's not always as it seems, but then that can be the case when you're developing your theory of change as well. So how do you avoid it just becoming like a, you know, I guess an echo that's just just your own thinking reflected within there. And so a few tips here we find effective. So the first thing to mention is to think about once you've developed a first draft, and I always think develop your first draft first, you know, do that and then reflect on it. So then it's think about what evidence do you already have to support it. Now that can be written evidence from other people, from yourselves, from evaluations, but it can be your own experience as well. You know, that's obviously a very valid input to come into your theory of change. I would ask as well, could your mentors as experts in the field check or verify your theory of change for you? That seems like if I'm right, is an obvious way that you can already get an expert to be looking at your theory of change with you. But by balancing that with other evidence, external evidence as well, can be really helpful. So, you know, another thing is other peer organizations. I've seen organizations do this very successfully, where they ask other organizations to take a look at their theory of change for them and check it. That's very, very effective. And finally, I've got existing evidence, but what I mean here, sorry, is external. So reports, research from within the sector that could help to back up. I mean, another source would be the theory of change we developed for the course, which is an IRTS example theory of change. That came from 2 or 3 organizations feeding in. So again, could be a very good source for checking your theory of change. So I would develop it first and then do go through verifying it with other organizations. And finally, getting the right level of detail. This is a big question we get asked. How detailed should the theory of change be? It's always a balance between the detail that you need to reflect complexity. So this was my 2009 first attempt at a theory of change in a workshop. They called it a spider's web. I think my theories of change tend to get nicknames, which I don't know if that's always the best thing, but it was so confusing that they needed to go outside and have a break for 15 minutes and come back in. I nearly killed off my participants. It was my first one in my defense. But we were really trying to reflect how interconnected and how complex social change is. But that's a balance that you need to strike, because that's not readable to anybody, including the people who built it. So we did change it afterwards. So, it's not to be too worried if it's not reflecting the absolute detail of social change. It's got to still be readable to people. And that's where a narrative can really help, because if you're writing up a more detailed description of each section of your theory of change, you can say, well, okay, my one-page diagram can be super simple because I know I've got a more detailed document. For people who want more detail, I like more detail, but not everyone does. So it also depends on your what you're using your theory of change for, as we mentioned earlier. If it's just for communications, it might anyway be a bit less detailed. And finally, again, your mentor could help, again, to advise where you might cut down, what's more important to express as well. So there were, like, from my experience, last 10 years, that would be my main, or the 5 main challenges we've come across, including some of those that you sent in before the workshop.